This subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. As a reminder, I ask all members to keep themselves muted when they are not recognized. This will minimize disturbances while members are asking questions of our witnesses. The staff have been instructed not to mute members except where a member is not recognized and there is inadvertent background noise. Members are also reminded that they may only participate in one remote proceeding at a time. If you are participating today, please keep your camera on, and if you choose to attend a different remote proceeding, please turn your camera off. If members wish to be recognized during the hearing, please identify yourself by name to facilitate recognition. This hearing is entitled Dollars Against Democracy, Domestic Terrorist Financing in the Aftermath of the Insurrection. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. As we heard from Merrick Garland during his confirmation hearing earlier this week, the country faces a, quote, more dangerous period in the wake of January 6th than we did after the Oklahoma City bombing, the single deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. This threat is real, and it is therefore incumbent on all of us on the subcommittee to look at the ways that these extremist groups fund not only their violent activities, but their recruitment and radicalization efforts as well. In the wake of the attacks of September 11th, we recast the entire federal government and worked feverishly to defund terrorist streams. To effectively disrupt domestic extremist groups, we need to better understand their financing. In today's hearing, I want us to focus on 3 important areas. First, is to better understand how these groups are raising money. Unlike ISIS, for example, these organizations are not pyramid-shaped where funding comes from a handful of easily disruptible areas. An online fundraising drive for a legitimate charity and one that helps support an extremist group can look very similar. Some extremist groups are eschewing the traditional banking sector in favor of cryptocurrency, avoiding our traditional methods of disrupting extremist financing. Second is to give serious thought to where our efforts on disruption are best spent. Terrorist attacks rely on their asymmetrical nature to be effective. Many of the domestic terrorist attacks in recent memory have been self-funded. The bomb constructed by Timothy McVeigh cost less than $5,000. However, recruitment and radicalization efforts are often more resource and time intensive. Targeting these efforts may provide an avenue for preventing future attacks. Third, we need to conscientiously be mindful of the civil liberties concerns at play here. Unlike international extremist groups, law enforcement is constrained by the Constitution when dealing with domestic extremists. Balancing the desire to give law enforcement the tools necessary to disrupt these groups with the need to respect the rights of all Americans and the Constitution to which we have all pledged an oath is essential. I'll quickly note, in the spirit of my opening statement in the subcommittee's first hearing, that this hearing is not about whataboutism or both sidesism. The topic is domestic terrorism, and it must be divorced from any specific ideology. While we all lived through a brutal event on January 6th, undertaken by right-wing extremists, no location on the political spectrum has a monopoly on extremism or violence. Focusing on one group to score political points doesn't do anything to help us solve the very real problem at hand, and a problem that could get worse over time, as January 6th demonstrated to so many groups that they could, in fact, make the news and be effective in their dark ways. Finally, I'd like to thank our panel of witnesses whose expertise and experience in their respective fields is unparalleled. I sincerely appreciate your assistance in tackling this difficult issue. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
I thank the chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing and for your opening statement. And I appreciate the witnesses lending their expertise today. I know this is a topic that touches all members on this subcommittee and across the Capitol, for the events that transpired on January 6th arrested all of us deeply. While we've discussed domestic terrorism financing in the past, this meeting will hit closer to home from the previous ones. I look forward to the constructive dialogue on this topic as a way to bring both sides of the aisle closer together. The majority has taken the decision to convene this hearing in the aftermath of the horrific destruction and mayhem of January 6th. All of us are saddened and outraged by the actions of those involved in the evil and devastating act. All of us condemn the rioters' destruction and malice towards the peaceful conduct of the business of democracy here in the People's House. But I would be remiss if I didn't note that extremist events like this have been caused by both the far left and the far right all across our country. Even this week in Senate testimony, we're learning important details about the premeditation of the attack and the weakness in the Capitol security planning and preparation. To honor the rank and file men and women of law enforcement, I've sponsored a resolution with my good friend, Representative Ed Perlmutter, to celebrate the bravery of the Capitol Police, DC Metro, and other law enforcement officers. These men and women protected us with courage, and they should not be overlooked. I'm pleased to report that this resolution has strong bipartisan support with over 133 co-sponsors. It's important to note, though, that this is not the first time that our nation's capital and elected officials have been targeted. I'll spare the committee a long history lesson, but I will mention that prior to the events of January 6th, there have been 6 other attacks on the Capitol involving extremists ranging from white supremacists to anarchists. Most in this room will remember the members of this committee and our colleagues that were attacked during the congressional baseball game practice in 2017, committed by a terrorist fueled by rage against Republicans. Unfortunately, as the chairman said, extremism, both on the radical left and radical right in our country, is not new, and it affects all Americans. It's important that we investigate the funding for such attacks and mitigate extremists' ability to access it. Cutting off funding will inhibit their ability to grow and expand their abilities and scope. We need to craft bipartisan solutions to ensure that violence and hatred that fuel the attacks do not happen again. We must use our existing extensive laws and law enforcement operation and cooperation to identify and prosecute those on the left and right that attempt to use terror and violence. I appreciate the chairman. And in a final comment, I would hope I see our distinguished chair on the call. I would urge our chair when we are in Washington to invite her consideration of an in-person hearing. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair thanks the ranking member for his statement and now recognizes the chairwoman of the full committee, the gentlewoman from California, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think this is extraordinarily important. I thank you for holding this hearing. We're here against the backdrop of the January 6th insurrection, a deplorable yet predictable display of white supremacists such as the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, QAnon, and others, and nationalist violence incited by President Trump against the members of this body and against democracy itself. Unfortunately, the violence that we saw on the 6th is not new, but arises from our nation's legacy of violence towards people of color, religious minorities, LGBTQ plus persons, women, and immigrants, from the KKK and lynchings to the terror in Charleston, Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, El Paso, and Escondido, while white supremacists and nationalism are not new threats. But there is hope. The radicalization, recruitment, training, and operations that made January 6th possible also had a money trail, which can and must be targeted to turn the tide against future attacks. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And so we begin by welcoming the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. We have 5 witnesses today. First, Ms. Iman Boukadoum, who is a senior manager at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Second, Ms. Lecia Brooks, who is executive director at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Third, Mr. Daniel Glaser, who is global head of jurisdictional services and head of the Washington, D.C. office of K2 Integrity and senior advisor at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and former Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the Department of Treasury. Fourth, Dr. Daniel Rogers, who is co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of the Global Disinformation Index. Fifth, Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross, who is Chief Executive Officer at Valens Global. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left, and a chime will go off at the end of your time. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony if you hear the chime, so that we can be respectful of both the witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Ms. Boukadoum, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, and distinguished members, thank you for holding this timely hearing today. Last month's violent insurrection, heavily fueled by white supremacy and white nationalism, shocked the world. But it didn't shock me. It didn't shock my community or marginalized communities, because we are not new to white nationalist violence. Personally, as a Muslim and Algerian American, I appreciate the opportunity to be heard today as we wrestle with the aftermath of this horrific day. We echo the sense of urgency shared by many of you today in Congress regarding the very real threat of white nationalist violence. And I would just note that our coalition has been ringing the alarm relating to white nationalist violence for generations. We know, however, that even well-intentioned national security laws are invariably weaponized against Black, brown, and Muslim communities, and that white nationalist violence is not prioritized, making that policy failure the fundamental reason for what transpired on January 6th, not lack of legal authority. For this reason, we oppose any legislation that would create new charges for domestic terrorism or any enhanced or additional criminal penalties. The federal government, including the Treasury Department, has many tools at its disposal to investigate, and also the FBI and DOJ have 50 statutes, at least 50 statutes, and over a dozen criminal statutes, 50 terrorism-related statutes, and over a dozen criminal statutes that they can use. They just need to use them to target white nationalist violence. And of course, we know that white nationalist violence and violence inspired by Muslims or ISIS and Al-Qaeda inspired violence is very differently treated in this country. The over-policing of charitable giving by Muslims, for example, in my community, which is a core part of my faith, has led to the effective forfeiting of our First Amendment rights. The failure to prioritize white nationalist crimes and the over-policing of innocuous financial transactions by mosques or those originating from the Middle East or people with Middle Eastern names has taken attention away from the clear and present threat of white nationalist violence percolating all around us. And countless innocent people, particularly in the Muslim community, as I said, have effectively lost their right to perform religious duties for decades. What is clear is that the Treasury Department and other federal law enforcement agencies already have vast administrative and statutory authorities at their disposal, which they routinely use to disrupt financing relating to clandestine activity by freezing bank accounts and stopping those transactions. And what history demonstrates is that providing additional national security authorities to fight domestic terrorism would devastate already over-policed and over-surveilled communities of color and Muslims. I'd like to sum up with a few recommendations. First, the Jabara Hire No Hate Act is an important piece of legislation that must be passed. It centers communities and it would help with information sharing relating to hate crimes and would allow the Treasury Department to trace financial ties to white nationalist violence. Second, the DTPA, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, is a piece of legislation that we have endorsed and we believe will also help with information sharing, including with the Treasury Department to enhance clamping down on white nationalist violence. And third, we believe that hate crimes must be publicly or must be mandated, that hate crimes data must be reported and mandated for public consumption, and that government leaders must be able to see what is happening across our country within the hate crime space. And so I'll just conclude by saying that history has taught us that national security laws invariably harm the very communities they're supposed to protect, from COINTELPRO, the FBI's unlawful domestic surveillance operation that the Church Committee demonstrated in Congress was shamefully used against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders in the 1960s. And it too was justified as a national security program. And now after 9/11, we have seen similar counterterrorism frameworks used to unjustly target and harm Arabs, Muslims, and others, treating us as, and our religion as suspicious, compromising our First Amendment rights, freedoms, and due process rights. Adding national security authorities will only exacerbate these challenges. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Boukadoum. Ms. Brooks, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Himes, Chair Waters, Ranking Member Hill. My name is Lecia Brooks. I serve as the Chief of Staff at the Southern Poverty Law Center. For 50 years, SPLC has been a catalyst for racial justice in the South and beyond. We work in partnership with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance the human rights of all people. The SPLC began tracking white supremacist activity in the 1980s. Each year since 1990, we have conducted a census of hate groups operating across the U.S. as part of our annual Year in Hate and Extremism report. Our 2020 report, released this month, documented a decline in the number of hate groups, but not a decline in the strength and momentum of their movement. As the January 6th Capitol Hill siege affirmed, their threat to our democracy has not diminished. Far-right extremists are exploiting internet technology to create a broader, more decentralized, and more dangerous movement. The proliferation of numerous internet platforms has allowed individuals to engage with potentially violent movements like QAnon and Boukadoum without being card-carrying members of a particular group. Our testimony outlines how this movement finances itself in the decentralized way in which they now operate. The funding and financing of hate groups in this decentralized landscape is also changing in important ways. In the past, hate groups raised money by charging dues, selling products, or requiring the purchase of uniforms. Today, some white nationalist groups and personalities are raising funds through the distribution of propaganda itself. In November, SPLC researchers reported that dozens of extremist groups were earning thousands of dollars per month on a popular live streaming platform called DLive. As the post-election period became dominated by former President Trump's false assertion that the election was fraudulent, these DLive streamers shifted to video streaming at in-person events branded with the slogan, "Stop the Steal." Some of these same individuals were featured by House impeachment managers as key perpetrators of the violence on January 6th. You see, they had used DLive to live stream the events inside the Capitol and on the grounds. Crowdfunding is also being exploited by hate groups to earn money in this new decentralized landscape. Crowdfunding sites played a critical role in the Capitol insurrection, providing monetary support that allowed people to travel to Washington, D.C. They've also played a crucial role in raising hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees for extremists. The violent insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th should serve as a wake-up call for Congress, the Biden administration, internet companies, law enforcement, and public officials at every level. But we have had wake-up calls before, many of them, in fact. Charleston in 2015, Charlottesville in 2017, and Christchurch, New Zealand, and El Paso in 2019. As we all saw last month, we can no longer afford inaction. Some technology companies have taken steps in the right direction to combat the rise of hate and extremism on their platforms, but both government and internet companies must do far more. Let me close by highlighting 5 policy recommendations we included in our testimony. 1, tech companies must create and enforce terms of service to ensure that they do not become platforms for hate. They should prevent their sites from being used by extremist organizations to raise money for their illegal actions. 2, These companies should commit to much more transparency and regular outside audits to measure financial harms caused by their platforms. 3, Congress should prioritize the funding of programs for research into technologies that can be used to detect and prevent online financial harms while preserving human rights. 4, Congress should reject legislation to create a new federal criminal domestic terrorism statute. If passed as prologue, such a statute could be used to expand racial profiling or even be wielded to surveil and investigate communities of color and political opponents in the name of national security. Finally, we should make concerted efforts across government to improve federal hate crime data collection, training, and prevention. Data drives policy. We cannot address hate violence unless we measure it properly. Thank you for holding this important hearing. The SPLC looks forward to working with you as you continue to focus your urgent attention on this important issue.
Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Mr. Glaser, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hines, Ranking Member Hill, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to talk about how the U.S. government can employ similar tools and strategies against white nationalists and other domestic terrorist groups as it has employed against global jihadist groups over the past 2 decades. This is a personal issue for me. During my time at the Treasury Department, I fought to cut off funding to terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and Hezbollah. As a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bush administration, and eventually as the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing in the Obama administration, my primary responsibility was to lead the design and implementation of strategies to attack the financial networks of these groups and other threats to our country's national security. And while we should never let down our guard with respect to those still potent terrorist organizations, it has become tragically clear that there are domestic extremist groups that in some ways present an even greater threat to our ideals and our democracy. We have the responsibility to target those groups with the same determination, creativity, and sense of purpose that we displayed in the years following 9/11. To be sure, counter-illicit finance strategies are not silver bullets, and there are practical and constitutional limitations to domestic action that do not arise in the global context. But any comprehensive response to a national security threat must include a strategic financial component. It is my hope and expectation that the new leadership at the Treasury Department will turn its attention to precisely that challenge. From the outset, I must be clear that the purpose of a counter-illicit finance strategy is not to replace the traditional law enforcement tools, which will remain the foundation of any domestic effort. Supplementing those efforts, a counter-illicit finance strategy should seek to hinder the ability of extremist groups to use the financial system, to mask their identities, and to raise and move funds. The first step must be to understand the typologies and methods by which such groups raise and move funds and to map out their financial networks. This first step should be followed by 2 general categories of actions. First, offense, undermining the financial networks that support these groups, and second, defense, taking systemic action within the financial system to make it less vulnerable to abuse by these groups. It is sometimes stated that extremist groups are less vulnerable to financial measures because of their informal and decentralized structure. I believe that this is a hypothesis that has yet to be tested. Any group that engages in organized activity needs to raise and move funds, and when those activities extend nationwide or globally, it only increases such groups' reliance on the financial system. The U.S. government should undertake a comprehensive effort to understand how these extremist groups are accessing the financial system and to the extent possible to map their financial networks. Once the financial networks and activities of the extremist groups are better understood, the U.S. government should consider the application of targeted financial measures. The U.S. currently has all the authority it needs to apply targeted financial sanctions against foreign extremist groups, and it began to do so last spring with the designation of the Russian imperial movement. Unfortunately, the U.S. has yet to target additional foreign groups, and in contrast to previous campaigns against jihadist groups, Treasury has not followed up the initial Russian imperial movement designation with a financial pressure campaign involving waves of sanctions seeking to dismantle facilitation network. I encourage the U.S. government to pursue such a campaign as a priority matter. Practical and constitutional constraints give the US government far less ability to apply targeted financial measures against domestic groups. Congress should consider legislation allowing for sanctions-like authorities to protect the US financial system from abuse by domestic extremist groups. Such authorities will need to be tailored to ensure that the government complies with constitutional requirements, including First Amendment restrictions on how groups are targeted and due process restrictions on how such measures are applied. One consideration could be to forego the asset freezes usually associated with sanctions in favor of some more limited measures. There are also measures that the US government can take today to make the US financial system less vulnerable to abuse by extremist groups. The United States has a robust anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regime, but it can always be fine-tuned and adjusted to address new vulnerabilities, including those presented by domestic extremist groups. The potential measures in Treasury's toolbox include the issuance of guidance to financial institutions on financial typologies, methodologies, and red flags, the establishment of public-private partnerships, the use of information sharing authorities, and the use of geographic targeting orders. Taken together, these measures will strengthen the ability of financial institutions to identify, report, and impede the financial activity of domestic extremist groups, and will ensure that the US financial system is a hostile environment for these groups. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Glaser. Dr. Rogers, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak before you discussing the funding mechanisms of these domestic violent extremist groups. I am the co-founder and chief technology officer of the Global Disinformation Index, a nonprofit focused on catalyzing change in the technology industry to disrupt online disinformation. Last fall, my colleague Ben Decker and our team at the GDI collaborated with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue to conduct a study entitled Bankrolling Bigotry that examined the funding mechanisms of American hate groups. Many of the groups implicated in the events of January 6th are the same ones that we examined last year in our study. This is why I sit before you today to discuss a little bit about what we learned about how technology and payments companies enable groups like those that participated in the insurrection to operate. These groups leverage the internet as a primary means of disseminating their toxic ideologies and soliciting funds. One only needs to search Amazon or Etsy for the term QAnon to uncover shirts, hats, mugs, books, and other paraphernalia that both monetize and further popularize the domestic violent extremist threat. Images from that fateful day last month are rife with sweatshirts that say Camp Auschwitz, that until recently were for sale on websites like Teespring and Cafe Press. As we speak, at least 24 individuals indicted for their role in the January 6th insurrection, including 8 members of the Proud Boys, have used crowdfunding site GiveSendGo to raise nearly $250,000 in donations. And it's not just about the money. This merchandise acts as a sort of team jersey that helps these groups recruit new members and foment further hatred towards their targets. We analyzed the digital footprints of 73 groups across 60 websites and 225 social media accounts, and their use of 54 different online fundraising mechanisms, including 47 payment platforms and 5 different cryptocurrencies, ultimately finding 191 instances of hate groups using online fundraising services to support their activities. The funding mechanisms included both primary platforms like Amazon, intermediary platforms such as Stripe or Shopify, crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe, payments facilitators like PayPal, monetized content streaming services such as YouTube Super Chats, and cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. All of these payment mechanisms were linked to websites or social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Telegram, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Gab, BitChute, and others. The sheer number of companies I just mentioned is the first clue to the scale and the scope of the problem. This is not an issue of any one individual company, but rather a systemic problem of hate and bigotry exploiting an entire industry, and even government policy to raise funds, peddle extremist ideologies, and commit acts of violence. A number of conclusions stood out to us in performing this work. For starters, over half of the platforms we identified already have explicit policies against hate and extremism that are simply not enforced. We also found that a large fraction of the groups we studied have approved tax-exempt status with the IRS. A full 100% of anti-Muslim groups, 75% of anti-immigrant groups, and 70% of anti-LGBTQ groups have 501c3 or 501c4 status. Over 1/3 of the militia groups we identified, including the Oath Keepers, whose leadership was recently indicted on charges related to January 6th, have tax-exempt status. This status gives them access to a whole spectrum of charity fundraising tools, from Facebook donations to Amazon Smile, to the point where the most common fundraising platform we identified across all of our data was Charity Navigator. These platforms are reticent, to say the least, to make unilateral decisions that go against IRS determinations. The problems of hate groups of exploiting the tax code goes back decades and stems from a combination of lack of resources at IRS to properly enforce compliance, as well as long-standing efforts by some to exploit the charity rules for political and now extremist purposes. But the issue has become more urgent in the wake of January 6th. In the days leading up to the insurrection, the Oath Keepers founder, Stuart Rhodes, appeared on a podcast and solicited charitable donations to the Oath Keepers Educational Fund. It can only be presumed that these funds, which listeners were notably able to deduct from their federal taxes, went to transporting and lodging members of the group slated to participate in the ensuing riots. Private industry must also step up and do more. Since the publication of our report last October, we've documented at least 17 actions taken by platforms against the groups we've enumerated. For example, 4 of the 6 payment mechanisms routing funds to the Oath Keepers have been blocked. Amazon has even removed from Amazon Smile, but 17 actions out of 200 instances we observed speaks to the rampant way the problem has been allowed to persist. In fact, while most platforms have removed the Oath Keepers, payment facilitator RallyPay still to this day services the group's fundraising needs and has shown no signs of responding to public pressure to stop. More must be done. Industry-wide standards must be set, and enforcement across both the public and private sector must be stepped up. Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the committee, thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Glaser. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Dr. Gartenstein-Ross, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Domestic violent extremism is today uniquely poised for growth. Opportunities are driven by our information environment, by seemingly intractable global problems that governments appear incapable of addressing, by a nation riven by its differences, by an age where ethics and identity are in constant flux. Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of Violence Global, it's an honor to appear before you today. I think it's obvious how the backdrop I describe represents an attractive recruiting environment for any extremist group. This panel's consensus is that white supremacist extremism, or WSE, is the most pressing present threat. This is not just the panelists' opinion. Multiple US government assessments validate this view, as do relevant statistics. But white supremacist extremism is not the only concern in the domestic violent extremist, or DVE, space. In addition to documenting relevant WSE threat actors, my written testimony details street violence, assaults, arson, and intimidation employed by another militant stream. There has been a general rise in extremism. The opening remarks of the chairman and ranking member rightly emphasize that we are living through a dynamic, multifaceted ecosystem of extremism. Our divisions could plunge the US into serious conflict or even fragmentation. Scholars have discussed reciprocal radicalization, where opposite extremes strengthen both sides and give average people a reason to drift toward extremes. Reciprocal radicalization shows that power and success of groups aligned with one extremist ideology fuel ostensibly opposing groups. Though different forms of extremism can thrive off of one another, society suffers. Our policies must be appropriate to this environment. Any policies to combat DVE should be narrowly targeted and rights protective. Unfairly targeting only one ideology or seeking to criminalize constitutionally protected behaviors may push the country into deepening conflict. So what can be done? First, the US government should consider designating additional WSE groups as terrorist organizations. I single out WSE groups here because of the level of transnationalism in the movement, which is a prerequisite for designation under current law. The State Department's designation last year of the Russian imperial movement was significant, and it's worth considering further designations of violent groups that satisfy the criteria. Second, any current discussion of DVE financing will touch upon a domestic designation statute, allowing designation of purely domestic groups. This is the most direct way of addressing DVE groups financing, potentially criminalizing the act of funding them and letting authorities clamp down on their assets. Yet such a statute would be fraught with civil liberties concerns. Any such statute must be viewpoint neutral, with designations corresponding to the threat groups pose, not to the ideas that they espouse. The statute must be clear about predicate acts that could result in designation, and the threshold for designation should be relatively high. Third, we should more rigorously map relevant DVE groups and their finances. The current consensus among DVE experts is that these groups are relatively fluid and devoid of organizational hierarchy. This may be so, but there's a tendency for experts to see groups as disorganized or non-hierarchical when they have a hidden structure, something to which Mr. Glaser's testimony alluded. Our current understanding of DVE group structure and funds may be incomplete, and in the digital age, fluid structures can quickly morph into more concrete ones. Further research may present further policy options. Finally, the US government should devote resources to better understanding reciprocal radicalization and a related phenomenon, fringe fluidity, the transition of an individual or group from one extremist ideological stream to another. Better understanding these dynamics would afford us a better understanding of how violent extremists interact with each other. In conclusion, this hearing refers to the events of January 6th as an insurrection. Anybody who has been in an insurgency or a civil war situation knows that it's essential to reduce the potential pool from which militant factions can draw. Everyone who is a part of this hearing, members of Congress, experts, media, spectators, should understand that we are all a part of this story. Our work is not to score partisan points, but to make this democracy more resilient to the challenges it confronts. With the divisions we have, with today's unprecedented ability to mobilize for good or ill, we need to reduce the number of people who might try to impose their will on the rest of us by force. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gartenstein-Ross. We now come to the member question portion of the hearing. I thank all of the witnesses for that comprehensive testimony and now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. One thing that struck me, we heard 5 excellent witnesses. I don't believe I heard the word cyber currency once. It comes up a lot with my constituents. It comes up a lot in different contexts. So just to keep some organization, let me identify 2 of the witnesses to just offer a brief perspective on how the committee should think about cyber currency as an anonymous and potentially untraceable source of financing. Let me start with Ms. Brooks. Any thoughts?
I invite my colleague, Dr. Rogers, to take the first shot at that. Dr. Rogers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Congressman. That's a very interesting question and one that was included in our study. We looked at 5 different cryptocurrencies and their involvement in transferring funds to these groups. They're definitely there. They're definitely part of the fundraising strategies. What we noticed was that there was a strong correlation with the kind of explicit extremism of a group and their use of cryptocurrencies. So, you know, maybe less extreme groups or more cryptically extreme groups, for lack of a better word, had a more dominant use of traditional fundraising platforms that touched the kind of mainstream financial system. And what would happen is, as they were deplatformed off of those tools, those sites, they would migrate into the use of increasingly kind of anonymized cryptocurrencies. I should also point out that cryptocurrencies, I like to call them pseudonymous, not necessarily anonymous. And you know, there are efforts and ways to track transactions. The challenge being attributing, say, a particular cryptocurrency wallet to a particular actor. But we definitely saw use of cryptocurrencies generally by the most extreme groups that we studied.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. I do have one other question, but let me invite if any of the other witnesses have a different or additional perspective on cryptocurrencies. Let me just invite anybody who wants to chime in.
If I could chime in, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, please.
This is Danny Glaser talking. With respect to cryptocurrencies, I think it's important to remember that if you want to be able to use a cryptocurrency in the real economy to any scale, at some point does need to be converted into actual fiat currency, into dollars. That's the place where the Treasury Department does regulate cryptocurrencies, and cryptocurrency exchanges are regarded as money service businesses. They have full customer due diligence requirements. They have full money laundering program requirements. They have reporting requirements. The U.S. Treasury Department just last month issued a proposed rule relating to unhosted wallets of cryptocurrencies, and that's out for notice for notice and comment right now. It addresses the particular issue of wallets that are not hosted on a particular exchange, and I think it's an important rule that's out there, and I do encourage people to take a look at it. The comment period closes in May, and then hopefully Treasury will be able to take regulatory action to close that particular vulnerability.
Thank you, Mr. Glaser. I actually have an additional question for you, and I don't have a lot of time. One of the things that struck me about the testimony is that there weren't really calls for additional statute, in fact, additional law. In fact, two of our witnesses urged us to avoid it. Mr. Glaser, you though suggested something new that I'd like to give you maybe 30 seconds, the 42 seconds I have left to elaborate on. You said you were hopeful for sanctions-like authorities against domestic actors. You did nod to constitutional and civil liberties concerns, but give us another 30 seconds on exactly what you mean, and perhaps most importantly, what sort of Fourth Amendment overlay should accompany such authority?
Well, thank you for the question. The fact is that the Treasury Department really does not have a lot of authority to go after purely domestic groups in the way that it goes after global terrorist organizations. It simply doesn't have that authority. You could imagine an authority that does allow for the designation of domestic organizations. It would have to take into account constitutional restrictions. When you read a lot of the court decisions, there's concerns relating to notice. Those concerns could be addressed in a statute. There's concerns that a lot of the scrutiny is heightened because sanctions are usually accompanied with asset freezes. But you could imagine sanctions that don't involve asset freezes, that involve transaction bans, that involve regulatory type of requirements that you see in Section 311 of the Patriot Act. So there's a variety of ways that both the due process standards could be raised from what we see in the global context, and
Thank you, Mr. Glaser. I hate to cut you off, but I've got to be a little disciplined on time. Let me encourage you. I'm very interested in that. Let me encourage you, if you want to submit additional testimony, to do so. And before I recognize the ranking member, it was not startling. It was interesting to me that there were apparently no strong dissenting views on the concept of additional legislation. So if the witnesses have additional thoughts on that, the chairman would certainly welcome that in written form. And with that, the chair now recognizes the distinguished ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Chairman Himes. Excellent panel, really superb presentations and very informative. In looking at the draft legislation that the majority noticed with this hearing, one bill stuck out to me, and I think it's a good follow-up from your most recent exchange. It seeks to amend Title 31 to require the Secretary of the Treasury to establish a program to allow designated employees of financial institutions to access classified information related to terrorism, sedition, and insurrection. Now, over the past 3 Congresses, we've talked about the concept of a fusion center, not unlike we do in monitoring cyber risk and cyber crimes for this terror finance arena. We've never been able to come ashore on it legislatively. So I found that interesting. However, I'm concerned that when you deputize bank employees without any oversight as to how the information would be protected, or if there's really even a need for that. So I'd like some comments. So Dr. Gartenstein-Ross, could you describe how banks share information with law enforcement today and how they provide, and then provide feedback on how we might change these protocols, or if that protocol change is necessary?
Thank you, Ranking Member. There are four primary ways that banks share information now. The first is suspicious activity reports, or the SAR. Financial institutions have to file these documents with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, when there's a suspected case of money laundering or fraud. The SAR is designed to monitor activity in finance-related industries that are out of the ordinary, are a precursor to illegal activity, or could threaten public safety. Second, there's law enforcement's 314A power under the Patriot Act, in which it obtains potential lead information from financial institutions via FinCEN. Third, law enforcement can use its subpoena power if a court issues a subpoena pursuant to an investigation or to an administrative proceeding. And fourth, where there are blocked assets pursuant to OFAC authorities, sanctions or otherwise, banks are required to report blocked assets back to OFAC. The information sharing, in my view, is currently quite effective. Treasury, in particular, has a very strong relationship with U.S. financial institutions.
Well, thank you. And we made one tweak that was passed into law, signed into law last year, a bill of mine called the CLAW Act, where it encouraged cooperation on accounts kept open so that they could be pursued by law enforcement investigations. I appreciate the bipartisan support for that. On 314 in the Patriot Act, is that a place where we could, in a protected, appropriate way, make a change that relates to this domestic issue, or is that, in your view, too challenging?
No, I think it's a place where you could definitely make a change. The 314A process allows an investigator to canvass financial institutions for potential lead information that might otherwise never be uncovered. It's designed to allow disparate pieces of information to be identified, centralized, and evaluated. So when law enforcement submits a request to FinCEN to get information from financial institutions, it has to submit a written certification that each individual or entity about which the information is sought is engaged in or reasonably suspected of engaging in terrorist activity or money laundering. I think that in some cases, 314A may already be usable, but I think it's worth looking at the 314A process to see if in this particular context, when you're looking at domestic violent extremism, as opposed to foreign terrorist organizations, there are some tweaks that would provide ability to get leads in this manner.
Yeah, I share all the chairman's concerns about this, but I'd invite you to write the committee more details about how one might make a regulatory or procedural change there at Treasury on that topic. Let me switch subjects. You made a very interesting point in your comment about mapping these extremist groups' organizational capability. Can you expand on the mapping part? You've got about 30 seconds, and I'll turn it to you.
Yes, sir. Basically, right now, and you heard several witnesses say this, and I'm not disputing this, the view of these groups is that they tend to be rather hierarchy-less. They're not very vertical in structure. And what I've noticed in the realm of extremist groups is sometimes there are hidden structures that we experts are slow to recognize. I know that one of the proposed bills on the GAO would look in more detail into the assets that DVE groups have. I think that's a good idea. I think that we could do more to map the assets and understand the flow of funds to these organizations, sir.
Well, thanks for your time, Chairman. Thank you for your leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the full committee, Mrs. Waters, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so very much for allocating this time. I'd like to direct a question to Daniel, Glaser, and perhaps Ms. Brooks also. As you know, Henry Enrique Tarrio is known as the national chair of the Proud Boys. And he was in town prior to January 6th, and he was ushered out of town by the local Metropolitan Police. But what's interesting about him is he had a relationship with the FBI. and he became an informant for the FBI. And he informed on people with drugs and gambling and human smuggling and some other things. But it appears that they turned a blind eye to the fact that he was a domestic terrorist and basically, was participating in terrorist activities, etc., and getting away with it, and said that before going into rallies, they would inform law enforcement that the Proud Boys were going to be involved. Now, even though this hearing is based on financing, I guess my question, Mr. Glaser and Ms. Brooks, is this: should we look at public policy that would not allow the FBI to have these kinds of relationships where they would turn a blind eye to domestic terrorism in exchange for information and informing on drugs and gambling and that kind of thing, Mr. Glaser?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman. I certainly don't think the FBI should be turning a blind eye to white supremacy and to domestic terrorism of any kind. Of course, the FBI has a difficult job to manage in terms of figuring out the best way to collect information that it could act upon. I don't know that I know enough about the internal deliberations within the FBI that led it to make the decisions that it made, but I certainly do agree that we should be, and I don't think we had been, and when I was in government, we certainly, I'll take that as a criticism of myself as well. We certainly did not prioritize efforts against white supremacy as much as we should have, and I think that is changing now, and I think it needs to continue to change. And I think it should change throughout the government.
Okay, thank you very much. It is, I think, very important to understand whether or not the FBI will use criminals and domestic terrorists and turn a blind eye in exchange for information about drugs, gambling, and other things. I knew that happened in dealing with drug dealers, where they let some drug dealers stay free if they turn in other drug dealers. But this is something, it appears they didn't care about domestic terrorism. Do you know anything about this? I think this is Ms. Brooks. Have you heard about the Proud Boys and their relationship to the FBI?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. I completely agree with my colleague, Mr. Glaser, that they should not turn a blind eye. The Southern Poverty Law Center would say that it's because we failed to take the threat of white supremacy and white nationalists, we failed to recognize the importance of it. And so that the FBI would engage in some information sharing at the risk of our democracy is untenable. And I believe that's solely because, as we saw January 6th, we failed to recognize the threat. I believe that we've learned some things, and hopefully the information sharing will be taken seriously, and we will recognize that the greatest threat to our homeland is from white nationalists with a white supremacist ideology.
Do you think that I or the chair or anyone should pursue public policy in this area of
Yes, ma'am.
turning a blind eye from our law enforcement in exchange for information that they could give them on other kinds of crimes?
Yes, ma'am. I do think that it's something that you should look into. The Southern Poverty Law Center is happy to assist in that, and we can bring some research together and add it to the record if you like.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Hill. Unfortunately, January 6th was the second politically motivated attack that I have been involved in with the past 4 years. As we've talked already this morning, on June 14th, 2017, a crazy Bernie Sanders supporter opened fire on a Republican congressional baseball practice that injured myself, along with 5 other individuals. Because of the heroic actions of the Capitol police officers, Griner and Bailey, and with God being in charge, the only fatality that day was the crazed shooter. Now, this was a politically motivated attack driven by anger and extremism, where signs were posted on social media beforehand. And some of the posts read, "Republicans are the Taliban of the USA," and it is time to destroy Trump and company. Unfortunately, if you went on Twitter or Facebook right now, you would find similar messages from hundreds of people spewing this type of hate. So, Ms. Boukadoum, how could we possibly monitor everything posted on the internet without greatly expanding the police state and significantly infringing on our First Amendment and all Americans' constitutional rights?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I believe that there was a fundamental breakdown in law enforcement response on January 6th, and also when the attack happened by that Bernie Sanders supporter, because the law enforcement agencies in our country have disproportionately prioritized the wrong things. This is a question of prioritizing. We have not prioritized white nationalist violence. We have not prioritized violence that is motivated by actions. We have prioritized ideology. And that is deeply troubling. And in fact, as you said, Congressman, a violation of the Constitution. And so our position is that we must follow the acts of people. So if there is a threat made by people who, whether it's the Proud Boys or whether it's Bernie Sanders supporters, then law enforcement must follow that. What we've seen is a fixation on a certain type of terrorism that is inspired by so-called Muslim ideology, and that has blindsided us. And unfortunately, we missed a huge attack on January 6th, and many people died, and many people are shocked still. So that's my answer to you.
All right. In 2019, the city of San Francisco voted to label the NRA a domestic terrorist organization. In August of 2020, Speaker Pelosi called Republican lawmakers enemies of the state. Now, with people being so quick to judge their political opponents as domestic terrorists, it makes me very uncomfortable with expanding the powers to go after our own citizens. So, Dr. Gartenstein-Ross, what safeguards are in place to make sure that any additional powers granted to the state are not abused for political gain?
Thank you, Representative Williams. That's a great question. And I share your concern about people throwing the word terrorist around or over-labeling in this regard. This is why when I emphasized, and to be very clear, I'm not advocating a domestic designation statute. I was simply making the case both for and against it. But for any additional powers that are given to the state, I think what is important is, number one, setting a clear threshold for what designation or what the predicate of a crime would mean. And secondly, making sure that it's keyed to actual terrorism. One thing we've seen over the course of the past year is that we have an unprecedented ability to mobilize for a variety of causes. Some mobilizations result in violence being inflicted by a variety of actors. And I think we're going to see more mobilizations around a variety of causes that end up with violence being a part of the mobilization. I think we need to understand any powers given to the state against that context and against the context that you emphasize, that there are a variety of groups, a variety of individuals who increasingly see their opponents as evil and harming them as something which naturally flows from their very binary worldview.
Okay. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, I've been very concerned about having our kids out of school and learning remotely. The social skills that our children learn through interacting with other people their age cannot be replicated over a computer and never will be. We've always already seen reports of increased mental health issues, depression, and suicides as a result of the COVID-19 lockdown. So, Dr. Rogers, can you talk about the role that isolation and mental health play in radicalizing individuals to carry out these horrible attacks?
The gentleman's time has expired, so the witness sadly will have to provide that statement as an amendment to the witness's testimony. Just for clarity, the chair, since we're getting started on these hearings, the chair will allow the witnesses the courtesy to finish an answer that they have begun before the timer goes off, just as a matter of courtesy and good transmission of information. But that courteousness will begin to be revoked 15 or so seconds into the after the timer. And so with that, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member Hill. Thank you very much for calling together this important hearing, and to all of our witnesses for being here today. I proposed bipartisan legislation called the FASTER Act, featured in today's hearing. This bill will help law enforcement to freeze the assets of domestic terrorists facing federal charges for insurrection and seditious conspiracy, like those who stormed the Capitol, but also like ISIS-inspired lone wolf terrorists and others of that ilk. Mr. Glaser, given your experience in the private sector and as the former Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, you know that for foreign terrorist organizations, the threshold for asset seizure is low. Given what transpired at the Capitol, do you believe that law enforcement could make use of greater authorities in certain cases for domestic extremism, such as insurrection or seditious conspiracy?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And to be clear, I think we need to make a distinction between seizure and forfeiture on the one hand and freezing assets on the other hand. The standard for seizing and forfeiting assets under any circumstance is the same under a criminal or civil forfeiture. It's relatively lower with respect to freezing assets for foreign organizations, and I think and as I was saying. When I talk about a domestic terrorist financing authority, I'm talking about the application of sanctions like authority in that case, but it doesn't necessarily have to involve a freeze. But to answer your question with respect to your legislation, I do think it addresses a lot of concerns with respect to immobilizing assets quickly. It is linked to the criminal justice system. It is not linked to more traditional terrorist financing type of activity that the Treasury Department would be involved in. I guess my question is whether or not an asset forfeiture count within an indictment would serve a similar purpose. But I do certainly applaud your effort to ensure that assets relating to insurrection are quickly immobilized, and it seems to me that's what the statute is trying to do.
Thank you, sir. And just to follow up, do you believe that the current financial intelligence system we have in place is effective in providing the proper data to law enforcement to combat the financing of these attacks?
I think that our anti-money laundering counter-terrorist financing system does generate an enormous amount of information for the government to analyze and then use. I think there are ways that could be improved. Public-private partnerships are very important. David talked about the use of 314, both A and B, to transfer information. And I think there are maybe tweaks we could make to the suspicious activity reporting that would provide even not necessarily more information, but better information. Certainly, there's technology that also could be employed by the government and by financial institutions to allow them to go through the massive amounts of data that banks need to go through to file quality suspicious activity reports. So I think there's plenty of ways the system can be improved. But the fact is that Treasury has access to massive amounts of financial information, and I think the focus should be on improving the quality, not necessarily the quantity.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Brooks, in the work that the Southern Poverty Law Center has done to track domestic extremist groups like the ones that attacked the Capitol on January 6th, have you observed increased use of 21st century technologies to enable these groups? For example, using websites that are outside of the mainstream to organize, spread hate, and fundraising tools like cryptocurrencies that are more difficult for law enforcement to track?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. And this really speaks to the earlier question as well. As I mentioned in my oral testimony, we note a massive decentralization of these groups and a disbursement of groups. So it makes it kind of harder to track and harder to follow the money. And we have noticed that the groups are continuing to self-disperse. So
Are they using cryptocurrency? Have you noticed them using cryptocurrencies?
Oh, yes, sir. Hold on one second. I had something on that. Yes, monetized propaganda is continued to increase, and we see a lot of personalities distributing. I'm sorry, I apologize.
Okay.
I'm looking for my notes on that. Hold on a second.
Okay.
On December 8th, someone for the far right personalities distributed 28. Oh, sorry. I'll stop.
Mr. Chairman, will you allow the witness to answer the question? Is that okay?
Yeah, if the witness would like to quickly conclude her answer, that's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. In a single Bitcoin transaction, we noted about $523,000 exchanged on blockchain. So the recipients included Nick Fuentes, who, as you know, is a far-right internet personality who was banned from YouTube and other platforms because of his hateful content. And so we continue to see this money transferring across lines.
Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I thank the chairman. I thank the witnesses for the expertise you've provided for this hearing and the preparation that goes into it. With each passing Congress, I want to share a concern. Really, with each passing Congress, we further erode the Fourth Amendment under the guise of promoting national security. This has evolved from a trend to a real tradition. As an example, the Corporate Transparency Act took a large chip out of the Fourth Amendment last year. I fear that January 6th will be used as another reason to further destroy the Fourth Amendment and the protections it provides. Mr. Glaser's testimony states that the U.S. anti-money laundering CFT regime can always be fine-tuned and adjusted to address a variety of vulnerabilities, including those presented by racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist groups. Glaser then lists out different tools the Treasury could fine-tune and adjust. Let's take a moment to translate what it means to fine-tune and adjust this AML toolbox. It really further means that we're further intruding on individual privacy by handing the government more and more of a person's financial records. At what point do we draw the line? January 6th cannot and should not be used to destroy our right to privacy even further. And frankly, I was encouraged by Ms. Brooks' notion that we should resist the temptation to further empower the federal government because it's been abused. And frankly, it's been abused heavily towards minority groups in the past. And now, under the guise of protecting them, it would be a shame to see further powers that erode privacy protections. So I urge my colleagues to speak up on this topic and the narrative that really attacks the Fourth Amendment right to privacy. Mr. Glaser, in your testimony, you said that the government should consider legislation to protect the U.S. financial system from being abused by domestic terrorists. You acknowledge that the legislation would have to be tailored to comply with the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment, but you really don't make mention of the Fourth Amendment anywhere. My question is, what constitutes an unreasonable search of an American citizen? Should Americans have any expectation of privacy with respect to their personal finances? Where is that limit? Because it sounds like there might not be one. In fact, the word privacy isn't even mentioned in your testimony.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. In my testimony, I did make reference to constitutional due process requirements. I didn't specifically mention the Fourth Amendment, but of course, the Fourth Amendment is where many of those constitutional due process requirements are contained. So it certainly wasn't my intention to imply that the Fourth Amendment shouldn't be, we shouldn't ensure that the Fourth Amendment protections adhere. I'd also note that with respect to the AML CFT measures that I recommend taken, none of them involve providing the government with more financial records.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I do get that. And look, you've served in a very important post, one of the most important in our government, for that matter, in my view, in terms of overseeing this part of Treasury, which is really vital for our national security. And I think it's relevant to Chairman Himes to be holding the hearing on the topic. So the tension is just so incredibly important. I guess the core question is, do you believe that Americans should have an expectation of privacy with respect to their personal finances?
Yes, of course, I think Americans should have an expectation of privacy with respect to their personal finances. As with every other privacy consideration, it's a question of balancing where the limitations of that privacy begin and end. And I think it's certainly possible, and I think we do so every day, to respect people's privacy on the one hand, but also give the government the tools it needs to protect its citizens from other threats. Because the threats to civil liberties come in all directions.
Yeah, they are, and I appreciate that. I apologize. I have to get at least one more question, and I have about a dozen. So, but I look, Mr. Gartenstein-Ross, according to the LexisNexis report last fall, the scope of AML is huge. So my question is, should we double down on a static AML system in an ever-evolving industry that's growing compliance costs? Or should we try to overhaul it? There was a really good BuzzFeed article last year that talked about the problems where the biggest banks, frankly, are the biggest money launderers. How do we address that?
The gentleman's time is expired. We'll need to respond to this. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, recognized for 5 minutes.
Wow, that was good. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Both the Code of Federal Regulations and the Patriot Act provides a federal definition of domestic terrorism. But as been noted, there is no federal designation of domestic terrorism, nor is there federal prosecution of domestic terrorism as a crime unto itself, all of which has me wondering, what is the point of defining domestic terrorism in federal law? If it results in neither designation or prosecution, what practical impact does the federal definition have on domestic counterterrorism, and in particular counterterrorism finance? And that question can go to Mr. Glaser. Mr. Glaser? You're on mute, Mr. Glaser? Hello?
Can you?
No, you're no longer on mute. You're on mute, Mr. Glaser.
The chair will instruct that 25 seconds be added back to the gentleman from New York's time.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chair. Mr. Glaser,
are you with us?
Mr. Glaser, you're on.
I'm
okay.
not on mute.
Thank you. You're not on mute. Mr. Glaser, you're on mute. Is there anyone else on the panel who can address this question?
I'm happy to jump in. The FBI's, the domestic terrorism definition that is in the Patriot Act is really defined for FBI investigatory purposes. And you're absolutely right, Congressman Torres, and it's good to see you again, that there is no parallel charge that goes with the domestic terrorism definition. So it's really designed for investigatory purposes. What we submit is that the material support for terrorism statute, as we know, there are two of them. There's one with an international nexus that is required, and there's one that allows for investigating material support for terrorism, domestic terrorism in particular, as defined in the Patriot Act, with underlying statutes that allows for any crimes that take place within the United States that have no international nexus. And we believe that that second piece of the material support for terrorism statute has been neglected and can be nicely used with the domestic terrorism definition as laid out in the Patriot Act. And we hope that statutory framework will be used to actually go after violent white nationalists and others.
Much has been said about the First Amendment and domestic counterterrorism. I have a hypothetical. Suppose there were a white supremacist organization with a stated mission, a publicly stated mission of murdering minorities, overthrowing the government, and establishing a white ethno-state. Could the federal government legally open an investigation into the membership and financing of such an organization without running afoul of the First Amendment?
That's an excellent question, and it's not a hypothetical, Congressman. It's actually a fact. We've seen, as my friends and colleagues at the Southern Poverty Law Center, who are part of our coalition, have highlighted time and time again, that there are myriad organizations that have absolutely espoused violence out in public, on Facebook, on big tech platforms, that have not been taken seriously. And so, yes, absolutely, the financial institutions and financial enforcement apparatus can trace those groups and should be tracing those groups, frankly. But as I said, there has been a deprioritization of white nationalist violence at the expense of our collective security. So I would submit that there is nothing wrong, or there is nothing that runs afoul of the First Amendment to go into investigating those types of groups.
And I want to make one observation, and let me know if you agree or not, but it seems to me there's a cognitive dissonance or a double standard on the part of law enforcement. If you're a member of a violent enterprise, like the mafia or a gang, you can be prosecuted under the RICO law. But if you're a member of a violent white supremacist enterprise, then somehow you're protected by the First Amendment. Can anyone on the panel explain the disconnect there?
I think that's another an excellent point. And in my written testimony that we submitted for the record, we highlight that RICO and conspiracy statutes are extremely broad and should absolutely be used against particularly organized white nationalist groups that, as you mentioned, espouse an ethno-nationalist state that wants to get rid of and kill millions of people. But I would love to open it up for my other panelists.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Representative Torres. And I completely agree there. The Southern Poverty Law Center documents white nationalist groups today. To be clear, their mandate is to create a white ethno-state. And they have proved time and time again that they'll still carry out violent means to reach that end. I would also offer that the Southern Poverty Law Center has used RICO statutes in the course of our civil suits against hate and extremist groups over the past couple of decades. And I think that those are the laws that we mean when we say that there exist current statutes that law enforcement could use to address the real threat of domestic terrorism. And for me, and I agree with my colleague from the Leadership Conference, that it's important that we educate ourselves and recognize the very real threat of domestic terrorism. That's why the Southern Poverty Law Center supports the Prevention Act. Law, as you know, is a very, very blunt tool, and we advocate for further education and communication and coordination between DHS, the Justice, and the FBI. And they could really work together to lower the threat level and strengthen a partnership that would blunt these hate and extremist groups. So thank you for the question.
Well, the gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for today's testimony. It's an important hearing, and Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate your comments at the beginning about this shouldn't have a political lens on it, and I think we need to be honest with ourselves about that. I want to start by referencing the testimony of Dr. Gartenstein-Ross. You talked about, in chilling fashion, how extremism is poised for growth. Unfortunately, I agree with you 100% for a variety of reasons. And you also highlighted reciprocal radicalization. And I think that's right. I would argue that there's an escalating component to it as well. One side does one thing, the other side escalates and radicalizes, and there's a counter movement that does the same. And we're in this ping pong of extremism, unfortunately. So with that is my first question for Dr. Gartenstein-Ross. In your research, did you find that any of the political violence from the summer, and I'm not creating an equivalency, so let's just get that clear. What happened at the Capitol was
far worse. I'm not creating an equivalency, but I'm trying to understand the mechanisms. In your eyes, did the political violence from the summer inspire or activate some of the far-right nationalist movements that we saw at the Capitol?
Thank you, sir, for that question. I would say it's unsettled, but I believe that the answer is yes in a rather subtle way. There's a really good book called How Terror Evolves by Yannick Vieux-Lepage. And what it argues, it looks at airplane hijackings. And it argues that tactics evolve from one group to another, regardless of ideology. And it even looks at criminal groups that have used airplane hijackings. I think what we saw over the course of the past year is a number of different mobilizations, starting with the anti-lockdown mobilization. Then there was a racial justice mobilization, then an anti-fascist / anarchist mobilization, and finally a pro-Trump stolen election mobilization. And those aren't all extremist mobilizations by any means, but all of them were mobilizations that were very powerful. And I think that each mobilization learned from the other. One of the lessons that was learned by the time of the Capitol attack is that attacking a symbol of government is extraordinarily dramatic. And there are multiple examples of that, from attacks on mayor's offices to autonomous zones and attacks on police precincts, that provided some tactical guide for what occurred. So I do think that different groups, both extremist and non-extremist, are learning to mobilize faster than before, and all of them are learning from one another's tactics, and tactics that we may applaud today may be used tomorrow by a group that we utterly despise and that despises us.
Thank you for that answer. And a follow-up, what role do public figures, politicians or otherwise, play in contributing to the violent behavior that we've seen across society over the last year? And how can we be better leaders? This is where I want you to lecture us and tell us how we have failed the American people. So go for it.
So I love the question. And look, we are in an extraordinarily polarized environment where even the slightest differences of point of view can lead to recrimination, fear, calls for people to be fired, different labels being thrust upon other people. I think now is a time for political leaders to show wisdom. And I think let me applaud this subcommittee for the bipartisan way that it put this hearing together. I applaud it for getting witnesses who can speak to both sides of the aisle. But I agree with the premise of the question that ultimately we need to figure out how to step back from the precipice. We need to figure out how we live together within a system that we all support. We need to figure out how the fact that the person next to us disagrees on some issues doesn't cause us to think of that person in a binary way as being evil or beneath us or someone who's our enemy. We're struggling with that. And part of it is politicians. Part of it is the systems of communication that we have. It's a complex, multifaceted problem. But the question you ask, sir, is the exact right question. And politicians have often been a part of the problem.
Thank you. And with my final 30 seconds, I'm going to share a brief story. So I voted for impeachment, as most of y'all know, and I'm a Republican. So I've been the subject of threats in two different instances in the last year, one from the left, one from the right. And I will tell you, my personal opinion is if this body and some of us on this committee don't start acting more responsibly, what happened in January is only the beginning. And that's up to us. That requires real leadership. And so I thank you for your answer, and I hope we'll heed those lessons.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Hello, Mr. Chairman. Can Mr. Glaser hear me now? Is he back on or no? Okay. Can he speak? I don't want to ask him questions if he can't speak.
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. Okay, so you're back
Fantastic.
on. All right. Well, Mr. Chairman, first I want to congratulate you on your chairmanship. I am proud and happy to be a member of this subcommittee. And thanks for putting this hearing together. Congratulations to the ranking member as well. I want to talk about cryptocurrencies a little bit. You know, the use of cryptocurrencies by terrorist networks, drug traffickers, and other illicit activities is well documented. I know, Mr. Glaser, we worked together when I used to chair the task force on terrorist financing back in the day. But we've got experts from FinCEN to the RAND Corporation. They've all expressed concerns about the use of cryptocurrencies by criminals. And we do have some examples that haven't been mentioned here. One example is the far right group, the white supremacist platform, the Daily Stormer. They actually solicit donations from users by cryptocurrency. They use Monero, but there've been high-profile, high-value Bitcoin transfers to a number of these U.S.-based. These are domestic far-right extremist wallets. So, and a matter of fact, earlier this month, Secretary Yellen stated, she said, and this is a quote, "I see the promise of these new technologies, but I also see the reality." She said, "Cryptocurrencies have been used to launder the profits of online drug traffickers, and they've also been used as a tool to finance terrorism." So Mr. Glaser and also Dr. Rogers, I think you could speak to this as well. How does the use of cryptocurrencies, and I chair the task force on fintech, and we're worried about this. We're trying to adopt some of these technologies, but this is one of those double-edged swords, I guess. How does the use of cryptocurrencies affect the ability of law enforcement agencies and research organizations and financial institutions to identify and trace the funding of domestic extremists?
Thank you for the question.
Take a crack at it.
Thank you for the question, Congressman Lynch, and it's good to see you again, and thank you for your leadership on these types of issues over the years. After 9/11, all the focus was on Hawala, and there was this notion that it was some sort of magical, mysterious system that nobody could comprehend, and it was impossible to trace through. And in the end, we found out that really wasn't the case. That it operated based on the same principles as a lot of other financial transfers, and it was just a matter of bringing it into the system in an appropriate way. And I think there's an analogy between that and cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies aren't inherently bad, and in fact, as Secretary Yellen said, they have a lot of useful purposes and could really help on issues such as financial inclusion. That said, they're also subject to abuse. So the challenge is to bring them into the system and regulate them in the appropriate way. I do think that the Treasury Department approaches it the right way through the regulation of exchanges, applying customer due diligence, programmatic requirements, and suspicious activity reporting requirements to the exchanges, which is where the cryptocurrency is ultimately transferred into fiat currency, and where fiat currency is transferred back into the cryptocurrency. Again, I highlight that FinCEN has a rule out right now, a proposed rule related to unhosted wallets, which is a loophole in the system right now, and that is a place where I think people should be focusing. But the fact is that there are some cryptocurrencies out there which try to design themselves along the fault lines of the AML-CFT restrictions. We need to look at those. We need to make sure that those types of cryptocurrencies are banned. But we also need to provide opportunities for the sector to grow in a supervised, regulated way, as I think it is for the most part right now.
Wouldn't it require getting rid of the pseudonymous nature where we don't have digital identities? Isn't that the core of the problem? And that's what the users or the advocates of crypto, a lot of them cling to that they want a decentralized, anonymous or pseudonymous system. Is that part of the problem?
Yes, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing rules and regulations at the end are about transparency. It's about transparency in the international financial system and the domestic financial system. And in certain ironic ways, cryptocurrencies provide enhanced opportunities in certain ways for law enforcement agencies to be able to trace transactions that aren't there in sort of bulk transactions in the private sector. But again, I come back to, you have to figure out where the points of entry are. And I think the point of entry is at the exchanges, which is where we're trying to regulate it now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing, and I appreciate the witnesses and the expertise that they bring to this important topic. And domestic terrorism obviously is something that I think with a little historical perspective, I think we remember Puerto Rican separatists shooting members of Congress, on the floor of the U.S. House back in the 50s. And so this is a long path that we've been going down and trying to fight this. And obviously, I was intrigued, Chairman, by your comments about the domestic terrorism being more difficult because they've got First and Fourth Amendment rights. But I remember my own time as a Marine on the U.S.-Mexican border contending with FISA and Posse Comitatus, dealing with the international component and really the Patriot Act, dealing with that and trying to figure out, well, okay, when does the international stop and the domestic begin, and how do we share data across between the CIA and the FBI, and how is that legal? When is that legal? Which unfortunately 9/11 really revealed to us we had some problems there. So just going down the path of making sure that we're sharing information across platforms, but at the same time protecting people's rights. And I think that's something that we're all conscious of, that push-pull. Senator Gartenstein-Ross, just in terms of the way you think about this, is there enough sharing between the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and local law enforcement? Are there regulatory or statutory changes that we can make at the congressional level to encourage information sharing so that we can actually prevent terrorist actions?
That's an excellent question. As you know, sir, DHS, one of its mandates is to share information with local law enforcement, which is a relatively effective system, although you've had a number of times where some of the information shared ends up getting leaked to the press, which in turn causes controversy and then impedes sharing. One of the reasons why we're so slow to look at WSE extremism as a government it relates to a 2009 controversy about a report on what was dubbed right-wing extremism at the time. So it's not clear to me that there are specific fixes that can immediately leap to mind, but I will say that this is something that we should look into to see if there are things that impede the flow of information. Anything that will allow information to be shared more widely will be a positive.
Mr. Glaser, just given your experience in government, I mean, what would you say to that in terms of information sharing between different, and again, I saw the restriction when it went from international to domestic. There was definitely some walls that were created there in the 70s that were knocked down a little bit after 9/11. But do we have those in terms of dealing with this problem?
Thank you for the question, and I agree with your premise that there needs to be a vibrant partnership between the public sector and the private sector to attack these sorts of issues. In fact, when I was in government,
we'll get to that in a second, but just the question is, within the federal government and local law enforcement, are there walls that you need to break down statutorily or by regulatory?
With respect to financial intelligence, I think that there's a very good information sharing between the federal government and the state government. State governments have access to suspicious activity reports. So I think that there's ways, there's probably mechanisms that we could implement to improve them, but they wouldn't be legislative in nature.
Okay, and then Mr. Boukadoum, just going to, I think this is something you're concerned about, is the role of private companies taking it on themselves to report to the authorities what they perceive to be problematic when they're not required to do it, right? And so I'm thinking recently there's an allegation that Bank of America went in, pulled all the data from their customers, reported that to law enforcement without having a warrant. And that, the interesting Fourth Amendment question, well, should government even be willing to accept data that they don't have the right to get, that the Fourth Amendment precludes them from? And I know I've heard your opening statement leads me to believe that you're concerned about this as well.
Absolutely, Congressman. I think that civil liberties have to be protected. And I think that the private sector, Bank of America, big tech have to really make sure that there's a notice requirement that is provided to customers, and also that there is yes, a warrant from the FISA court, even though it is a secret court, but there are mechanisms for making sure that due process and transparency, to the extent possible, are complied with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for hosting this important hearing. I'll get right to some questions. I thank all of those who are testifying today to help us understand this better. Mr. Rogers, if I could start with you, what evidence is there of alternative financing platforms contributing to expanded recruitment or radicalization of domestic terror groups? Do we have any evidence of alternative financing platforms?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. And if I may clarify, by alternative financing platforms, can you provide more detail about exactly the sorts of platforms you're referring to? I mean, we looked at a broad spectrum.
Fundraising.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the core of our entire research, was how extensively those sorts of platforms are being used, and that speaks to a lot of the discussion today. That most of the financial activity is not through the kind of traditional banking. There's a lot of other sort of companies and choke points being involved. Whether you're talking about crowdfunding platforms, I mentioned Give, Send, Go as an example, Rally Pay. All of these companies, they sit on top of standard kind of the larger kind of payments and banking. Like at the end of the day, the money lands somewhere that is a more traditional bank or payment provider. But even before you get to those companies, there's a whole host of smaller and more alternative, what you may call tech companies that are facilitating these payments. And we outlined, close to 100 of them in our report.
And would you say that those digital fundraising platforms are contributing to the diffusion of harmful ideologies?
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned in my testimony, not only are they just helping or facilitating raising funding for these groups, but merchandising platforms. I mean, Etsy. I say go to Etsy.com and type in QAnon, and the sale of merchandise helps further the ideology. Kind of create that, as I call it, that team jersey to help the group recruit and further whatever ideology they're peddling.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Glaser. If I could turn to you. FinCEN at the Department of Treasury is at the forefront of detecting illicit financial transactions involving potential crimes and terrorism. And I'm thinking of, for example, advisories regarding possible human trafficking or drug trafficking. But does FinCEN yet provide this type of guidance related to armed domestic extremists or mass shooters in terms of potential purchase of weapons, amassing of arsenals of guns, or other weapons for attacks? Is there such an advisory alert? I'm thinking about, we're examining communications and gaps in communications. Is there such an advisory around the amassing of weapons?
FinCEN does not currently have an advisory relating to domestic terrorism. I would not be surprised if they were working on one right now, and I think it's a great question. In my testimony, I specifically referenced that as one of the things that FinCEN could be doing. And as I said, I wouldn't be surprised if they were working on one right now, but there's not currently one out there.
Would the legislation, perhaps you're familiar with it, it was introduced last session by my friend, Representative Wexton. It was entitled Gun Violence Prevention Through Financial Intelligence Act. It was a bill in simplicity that would develop an advisory notification to assist financial institutions in detecting and then reporting suspicious or illegal financial activities around firearms. Do you think that legislation is worthy and would be a step in the right direction?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I must admit that I'm not specific legislation. I will say that banks already have the obligation to report suspicious activity to FinCEN, but that there are holes in it relating to illegal activity relating to firearms. I'm sure that's something that should be addressed.
Thanks so much. And maybe Ms. Brooks, I'll go for a quick question to you. How can the federal government provide better tools or facilitate coordination, again, about communication with state law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, the federal government? What should we be doing to share information efficiently?
Thank you for the question. The Southern Poverty Law Center, of course, supports the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act because it really is about improving communication and coordinating communication and response across agencies. Of course, it doesn't provide for additional federal criminal enforcement power, but we believe that improved communication and coordination was the big part of the issue on January 6th, so we support that. Just a
Thank you.
sharing of information and acting upon that information. Thank you for the question, Representative.
Thank you. I yield back. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes and Ranking Member Hill, of course, for convening this hearing. And thank you to the witnesses for joining us today and sharing your research and knowledge. We know that racism and right-wing extremism have a long history in this country. As an immigrant, I've seen it for most of my life. Donald Trump tapped into that from the very start of his campaign. And what happened here on January 6th is a symptom of something very serious. Like many of you, I was locked down in my office that afternoon. I didn't know whether an armed militia had entered my office building. I didn't know if they were looking for me as a proud immigrant, Mexican-American congressman, but I knew they wanted to stop a Democrat from being elected president. It's easy to say that the people who stormed the Capitol last month represent a small fringe in our politics, but they have allies and friends in high places. A couple of questions. Ms. Brooks, in your testimony, you gave us a good timeline of how racist extremism has connected to party politics. Could you talk a little more about how the radical right entered the mainstream and what we should be worried about moving forward?
Thank you so much for the question. As the Southern Poverty Law Center has documented over the last couple of decades, there's been an increase in the number of active hate groups in the United States. We found about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, that increase is directly connected to the shifting demographics within the United States. And so the decrease rather, in the white population serving as a numeric majority has served to create fear and anxiety in the white population. So as we saw with the ascension of President Obama as president, that was a kind of a peak moment and an example, if you will, for whites who were beginning to think that they were being displaced and feeding into a white nationalist trope around the Great Replacement or a white genocide. So we've seen an increase in that rhetoric. What we saw over the last 6 years was an increase in that rhetoric that was echoed from the highest office in the country, from the president. That served to kind of fuel and carry the disinformation, fear, and anxiety to this fever pitch position with which we find ourselves in today.
Thank you. Dr. Rogers, you've studied radicalization and terrorism in a number of countries, and your report on bankrolling bigotry mentioned that far-right groups use 501c3 nonprofit status to look legitimate. What role does money in our political system play in fanning the flames of right-wing extremism? Do all of these nonprofits and shell companies make it harder to track their role?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think that, I, for starters, am not an expert on tax-exempt organizations, and I'm certainly happy to point you to ones that I've worked with in the past. But as is my understanding, that the abuse by some of the charity and the nonprofit kind of tax-exempt rules has grown over time as say political campaigns and whatnot have become more expensive as a way to shield identities involved in political donations and things like that. And so that abuse has grown over the past decades. And while at the same time, the resources for enforcing the 501c3 and 501c4 rules, to say, if a group applies as a supposedly educational charity, to enforce that they actually are engaging in educational charitable activities and not, say, secretly a violent militia, the resources that IRS has to fulfill that regulatory compliance role have decreased over time for a whole host of reasons. So one of our recommendations that we've taken from one of our experts is to actually break out that function from IRS. IRS is ultimately a revenue generating organization, and this part of IRS is not by definition revenue generating, so it tends to be kind of ignored. If you took that regulatory function out, much as the Charity Commission in the UK is an independent organization to fulfill that role, that might help with the compliance and the enforcement problem. So just one idea related to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to those who are testifying today as part of our ongoing investigation into the insurrectionist attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The attack laid bare our vulnerability to domestic terrorism, and we need to examine solutions to stop future attacks before they happen. I believe it would be a grave mistake, however, to maintain permanent fencing around our Capitol. Constituents, advocates, have the right to visit the home of our democracy and speak with their representatives to share their thoughts, agreements, and concerns. We need innovative tools to root out domestic terrorism, protect members, staff, and visitors without turning this building into a fortress surrounded by fences capped with barbed wire. And indeed, we also need to find ways to protect places of worship in my own district without having them have to resort to a military posture as well. And in particular, Jewish places of worship. I represent one of the most densely populated Jewish districts in the country, and I know that my Jewish constituents who go to places of worship are increasingly on edge and increasingly concerned about the threats of domestic terrorism targeted and fueled by anti-Semitism. I wonder if first Ms. Brooks and then Mr. Rogers might speak for 30 seconds to a minute each about the intersection between anti-Semitism and domestic terrorism in this country, and whether they've seen a rise in both intent and actions targeted against Jewish people.
Thank you so much for the question. And we don't talk about this enough, but there's a direct link and a connection between white nationalism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. It should not be separated at all. There's been an increase in anti-Semitism in this country and globally for the last couple of decades, and people fail to pay attention. We have these major violent events like the Tree of Life Synagogue, like what happened in Escondido, and then we move on, but we're not connecting the dots. We are in this together, and a white supremacist agenda would separate everyone from who they are. So to be clear, we should stand together against white nationalism and anti-Semitism in support of it, and in support of the Jewish population. So thank you for the
Brooks,
question.
I just want to state for the record how much I agree with standing together. I think the Jewish people, as well as my African-American constituents, know that where there is conspiracy theorizing, where there is extremism, it's just a matter of time before they come for Black Americans and for Jewish Americans. Such has been our history. So thank you for saying that. And Mr. Rogers would welcome your thoughts as well.
Thank you, Congressman. And I could not agree more with both your thoughts and Ms. Brooks, your statement on the subject. Another subject that's personally very, I'm passionate about as well. As you say, if history is any guide, hate is hate, and it always comes for people of color and the Jewish community as well. One other point I would add is that in many ways the QAnon conspiracy theory phenomenon is itself a kind of remix, if you will, or a mashup of historically all of the various sort of anti-Semitic Jewish blood libels. The idea of the cabal at the top, et cetera, that if not explicit, very, very thinly veiled version of the same blood libel that's been circulating for 100, if not hundreds of years. And so, yes, I think they go very much hand in hand, whether explicit or not, and I think they are linked, and solidarity is obviously of utmost importance.
Mr. Rogers, are there particular actions that you would recommend Congress pursue relative to anti-Semitism and the intersection of anti-Semitism and domestic terrorism in particular, and the spread of disinformation about that?
I think there are a number of regulatory fronts that all kind of go to the general problem of disinformation as a whole. And I don't know that we have, the time to get into all of them here, but I think they certainly fall into three big categories, with the one most relevant to today's discussion being this idea of platform governance and platform liability, that our data is showing what a key role these sort of platforms play in facilitating the activities of these groups, and the fact that the liability is so nebulous or non-existent through things like Section 230 and whatnot, which what we found is that there's already policies in place against all of these hate and extremist groups, but they're just simply not enforced. And so updating that kind of platform liability to help drive enforcement, I think, is one of the key areas that we can focus on.
Slightly orthogonal question, and
the gentleman's time has expired.
Okay. Thanks.
I believe that every present member of the subcommittee has had an opportunity to question. If that's incorrect, speak up or forever hold your peace. Hearing no one, I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today and for an excellent discussion. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able, and I noted a couple of questions that sadly were cut off by the timer, and I'll ask the staff to facilitate that. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to fscdocuments@mail.house.gov. With that, I will thank our excellent witnesses one more time, and the hearing is adjourned.